All right, welcome everybody. I see some people joining the session. Thank you so much for being here. We're right at 3:30 and we're just going to give it a little bit of time before we get started so that we give other people time to join. So thank you. As you're joining, it's always great to see where people are coming from. So if you'd be willing to just type in your name and maybe the organization or the school that you're coming from and location. So I would say Jesse from Good Grief in New Jersey. Always great to see where we have people joining us. So again, thanks for being here and we'll get started in a few minutes. Hey, looks like we've got some folks from around New Jersey, West Windsor, Plainsboro, Asbury Park, Freehold. We've got a few people from outside of New Jersey, which is always great to see. Fort Collins, Colorado, Chicago, Greenwood, South Carolina. Hey, Kathy, great to have you here from University of Delaware, one of our facilitators. Hope you're doing well. Brooklyn, Tinley Park, Illinois, Beaverton, Oregon. This is great. We've got people from all over, Los Angeles, Pittsburgh, Saxonburg, PA, from Rutgers. Great. Thanks, Jamie. Welcome, everybody. If you're just joining us, we're giving it a couple more minutes before we get started. So if you just type your name into the chat and let us know where you're coming from, that would be great. Right, it looks like people joining is starting to slow down a little bit here. So I think we're just going to go ahead and get started, everyone, just so that we're mindful of everyone's time. Kelly, awesome. Hello from Turkey. Thanks for joining us. Really, really appreciate it. All right. So thank you so much for being here. My name is Jesse Bassett, and I'm the Director of Education at Good Grief. And welcome to this webinar on The Grief Remains, Leading with a Grief-Informed Lens in a Post-Pandemic World. I'm joined today by three panelists, Judy Colorado, Courtney Mick, and Chuck Rush, who are all local leaders here in New Jersey, who are going to share their perspective on how they are thinking about leading in the future in light of their experience through this past pandemic year. And I'm going to introduce all three of them formally in a few minutes after I do a little bit of setup, but I just wanted to acknowledge them and thank them so much for being here. Today's webinar is being recorded. We will be uploading the recording to our YouTube channel so that you can reference back to it or you can share it with people in your network as a resource in the future. Certificates of attendance and handouts from this session. I've got a few handouts to share, including the PowerPoint, will be distributed tomorrow afternoon in a follow-up email to everyone who attended. If you do not receive one, my best tip to you is to first check your spam folder at the end of the day. Sometimes we do end up there, unfortunately. And if you are calling into the session, we unfortunately don't really have a way of tracking you. This is an issue with Zoom. So please email me. You'll get an email from me following this the session, So just email me, let me know, and we'll take care of it for you. Or again, if for any reason you didn't get it, not in your spam folder, just reach out to us. We will make sure we take care of that for you. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in. For those who are new to Good Grief, we are a nonprofit organization that's been around in New Jersey since 2004. And our mission is to build resilience in children, strengthen families, and empower communities to grow from loss and adversity. For most of the organization's history, we've been providing free and unlimited peer support programs to grieving kids and their families, starting with children as young as 3 years old through young adulthood, after these individuals have experienced the death of an important person in their life. And in fact, our programming first started out of Christ Church in Summit, where Chuck is the pastor there, up in Summit, New Jersey. And so kind of a cool full circle thing here to have Chuck here today, sharing his own experience as well. In recent years, our work has been growing through education and advocacy to provide training, curriculum, and resources to places like schools and the healthcare industry, funerals, corporations, and other spaces, all with the hope of equipping professionals and parents in the broader community to support the needs of grieving kids and their families who have faced significant loss in their lives. This is not an informational session, so if you want to learn more about us and our work, I would encourage you to go check out our website, and I will type it into the chat here. It's just good-grief.org, and I will be sure to plug that at the end as well. So today, my plan for our time together, I want to identify the impact of this pandemic year and the increased death, loss, and ensuing grief that has been experienced by individuals, families, and communities. I want to explore the multidimensional nature of bereavement that serves as a foundation for grief-informed practice, identify principles of grief-informed practice to shape leadership, and then discuss challenges and opportunities that face schools and organizations with our 3 local leaders here in a panel dialogue. So let's go ahead and dive in, everybody. We will leave some time for some questions at the end, but if you do have questions that come up along the way, feel free to ask those questions. So this past year has been a year, as we all know, that has been filled with a lot of death. And this is an image that I pulled this from the New York Times. The CDC recently made it official that COVID-19 related deaths were the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States in 2020. Overall, we saw an increased mortality rate by 15%, accounting for all types of death in 2020 compared to 2019, which amounts to an increase of over 1 million people, again, when we compare it to total deaths in 2019. And in our field, researchers estimate that for every individual who dies, there are approximately 9 close kin who grieve that loss. So the numbers are pretty unfathomable in terms of the increased grief and loss that we are experiencing throughout this country and individuals are experiencing throughout the world. But beyond just death, we know that there have been many other forms of loss that we have faced in our communities. So I'm wondering if everybody in the session could just help me to brainstorm using the chat. What are other forms of loss that individuals, families, communities, businesses have faced this past year? There have been many of them. Yeah, great. Friendships, proms, graduations, jobs, work changes, financial, housing, divorce, contact with family, social life, businesses, routines, weddings, community, relationships, pets, socialization, sense of safety, control, memory, contact with school. Yeah, many, many different forms of loss. Thankfully, we are at a moment which is feeling much more hopeful and much more optimistic, with vaccination rates increasing and rates of infections, hospitalizations, and deaths all declining. This is a really, really good thing that we are all grateful for. And so I would say now we are kind of in the wake of this past year that's been filled with a lot of loss. And our question today that we're going to really kind of wrestle with is, how do we respond to all of the grief and loss in our community going forward? What needs to be changed in the way that we lead our local organizations, our schools, hospitals, faith communities to ensure that we're not leaving people behind. More important now than ever, we have to develop a really robust understanding of bereavement, and misconceptions around grief and loss still permeate our discussions, our policies, and our practices on a daily basis. So I want to start by just kind of sharing a little bit about kind of this multidimensional nature of grief and what it looks like. And then I'm going to introduce our panelists and we're going to have a discussion about it. So at the front end of all of this, really important for me to highlight that grief responses are highly unique and subjective. No two individuals respond in the same way. All of us, when we grieve, there is a descent that happens into sorrow and into pain. And then grief enacts this organic, multidimensional process that helps us to rebuild and to recover and to come out of this descent into this in the sorrow and in the pain. Many different factors are going to determine how someone responds: the nature of the loss, their age, previous exposure to crisis in their lives, nature of the relationship with the deceased, prior mental, physical, spiritual health, culture, religious traditions, socioeconomic status. Many different factors play a role. So no two individuals grieve in exactly the same way. There are some broad brushstrokes that I can paint here, though, to help us to understand the grieving process. First and foremost, grief is very physical. And I'm wondering, again, if people in the session could help us to brainstorm, what are some of the physical manifestations of grief that you are aware of? Yeah, loss of appetite, very common. Can't sleep, crying, stomach aches, back pain, fatigue. Yeah, very, very common fatigue. Just this feeling of exhaustion, sleep changes. I would add to the lists that's in there so far an overall heightened stress response. So that fight or flight response is kicking in that enacts all kinds of different reactions. Difficulty sleeping, decrease and increase in eating routines. Yeah, all those kinds of things. So grief manifests very, very physically in our brains, in our bodies. Grief is also very emotional. What are the different emotions of grief? And again, you can help me to brainstorm in the chat there. Yeah, anger, confusion, sadness. You might be able to name the different characters here from Inside Out. Disbelief, fear, relief. Yeah, many different emotion reactions. And many of us often assume that with grief, people will just mostly be sad or maybe lonely. But as we've kind of named in the chat here, there are many, many different emotion reactions, and all of them are highly dependent on, again, those variety of factors that I've already mentioned when it comes to the form of loss, their age, their understanding, etc. Grief is also very intellectual. What do you think I mean by the kind of intellectual aspect of bereavement? What do we think? Let's again just brainstorm in the chat there. I know someone in this session has some ideas. There we go. Trying to understand why it happened. Yeah. So the cognitive aspect of bereavement is often around kind of trying to grasp reality and permanence. When we lose something, there's often this kind of cognitive dissonance that kicks in. So the very kind of common example of this that many people that we work with at Good Grief experience is they wake up one day and it's maybe been months or even years after the person died, and they still expect to see them in the morning. And this is that kind of cognitive dissonance piece. So Many different intellectual responses, inability to accept the reality and the permanence, distressing thoughts or dreams, disorientation with sense of place or time, self-blame. For kids in particular, this idea of reality and permanence is so critical to help them to try to grasp what has happened. Grief is also highly spiritual. What do you think I mean by the spiritual nature of bereavement? Any ideas of folks in the session willing to put into the chat there? Yeah, thanks, Gabby. Yeah, so questions the presence of God. People may find comfort in religion. Yeah, this is where religious, cultural, familial traditions often play a really big role for people in the grieving process. This is all about meaning making. So all of us as human beings are meaning making machines. Even if you don't consider yourself a religious or a spiritual person, you are constantly crafting a narrative and a story about your life, your sense of identity and purpose. And this is really what I mean by we are spiritual people. And for some, this is going to link directly to specific religious and spiritual traditions and practices. For others, it may not. And yet, all of us are going to make meaning out of the kind of depths of these really difficult experiences as we form a new worldview and a new identity and sense of purpose in the world. Grief is also non-linear, an organic process. I mentioned this previously, but it's worth noting again. So many within our culture today still hold on to this notion that grief is a linear process that follows a series of stages or tasks that lead to some kind of endpoint that sounds something like closure or acceptance or moving on. You may have heard of some of these like buzzwords and phrases before. The reality of grief is much different for people who experience it. This is true from the work that we do at Good Grief, but it's also true in the literature and the research within our field. So many who we work with liken grief to a roller coaster ride with many twists and turns and ups and downs. It's not linear, it's certainly not neat, and doesn't follow a very clean trajectory. Grief really does evolve with us over time as humans, as we develop, grow, and change as people. And at new milestones throughout the rest of our life, we will experience grief in new and different ways. So there is no end point with grief. It does get better, but it never really fully goes away. So finally, grief is highly relational and contextual. And I'll talk more about this in a second when we talk about principles of grief-informed practice. But something I like to share with folks is a really interesting survey that was done by the New York Life Foundation in 2017. Over 1,000 individuals responded to this survey, all of whom had experienced a significant loss in their lives. The majority of these individuals reported that it took as many as 6 years to feel like they were moving forward after experiencing a loss, but that support from family and friends waned within 3 months. So there's a real gap in perceived support. And especially, we know at Good Grief is that people in year 2, 3 oftentimes struggle a lot more than even in the first year. So this is kind of an image of the quote unquote typical grieving family. We're very good at kind of following up and showing up in times of crisis. And this isn't a bad thing that we show up with the flowers, the food, and the cards. I'm not here to poo-poo that. We should continue to do it. But the problem for many people who are grieving is that as time goes on, support tends to fade. And this is particularly problematic when children and families really begin to struggle in year 2 and 3, and that feeling of isolation and loneliness starts to kick in. So this is kind of at the backdrop of part of the discussion I want to have today around grief-informed leadership and practice moving forward. Now that we are kind of in this kind of wake of the pandemic, as things are starting to get better, what does it look like to shape the way that we lead and support people in light of this past year? So I want to share 5 principles of grief-informed practice that really shape a lot of the work that we do at Good Grief and shape the work in our field. First and foremost, safety. So we want to ensure physical and psychological safety and trust. This really requires that we be open and honest in our policies, practices, and decisions around community loss. That we seek to acknowledge rather than ignore the pain that people are experiencing. Second, support. So building a culture of empathy and peer support in response to loss. What people need most is to feel a sense of connection and belonging and understanding. Grief is not solely an individual internal experience. It is a highly um, social experience that is shaped by environmental factors in the relationships and contexts in which we find ourselves. So we should consider this when we think about leading through times of grief and loss. How do we connect people to other people? Grief is normal, or we want to normalize bereavement. Loss is a normal, inevitable, and universal human experience. To be human means that we will experience loss. Grief is the natural response to loss. And at Good Grief, we would say it is the good and healthy response to loss. All people, regardless of nationality, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, will experience loss. And people have an innate capacity to adapt and to grieve. Fourth, respect. We should be respectful of race, ethnicity, culture, religion, sexual identity, and other factors that influence a person's identity and how they will navigate through grief. As leaders, we should approach these discussions and our conversations with people around bereavement with humility and compassion, and a compassionate curiosity that seeks to understand someone else's story and their experience. And finally, personal empowerment and agency. So healthy adaptation to loss is fostered by people reclaiming a sense of agency and empowerment and control over their lives. When we experience loss, we are thrust into chaos. The world feels out of control. This is the descent. And the coming out of that kind of pit of despair happens when we regain a sense of control and claim that sense of meaning and purpose in our lives. And this doesn't happen by other people telling us how we should or should not be grieving. So we need to give people space, flexibility, and permission to grieve in the way that is suitable for them. So I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to welcome our panelists. And I'm just going to quickly introduce them, and then we're going to open up for some discussion. So I'm really thrilled to be joined today by our three panelists, Judy, Courtney, and Chuck. And I'm just going to do a brief introduction of them, but I am going to post their bios following the session with the recording. So if you want to read more about them and their work, they all are incredibly impressive people. I encourage you to do so. So first, we're joined by Judy Colorado. Judy is the Chief Nursing Officer and Vice President for Patient Care Services at RWJ Barnabas Health and Monmouth Medical Centers in the Southern Campus. Judy, thank you so much for being here. Really glad to have you. Next, we have Courtney Mick. Courtney is a licensed social worker and founder and CEO of Courtney Channel LLC. And Courtney is also a school social worker at KIPP, New Jersey. And that's how I met Courtney. KIPP is one of our partners in our Good Grief Schools program. So Courtney, thank you so much for being here. And finally, we've got Reverend Dr. Charles T. Rush, also known by Chuck. Chuck is the senior minister at Christ Church in Summit. And as I mentioned previously, we got to know Chuck because Good Grief, when the organization started and launched programs, ran our programs first out of the church there in Summit, New Jersey. So we have a long history with Chuck, and we're grateful that you are here today as well. So to start off our kind of discussion here, I just want to invite each of you to tell us about yourself, your work, and how you've been witnessing grief and loss this past year. And maybe just to ease us into the discussion, I'll ask Judy if you'd be willing to kind of kick us off here.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. And again, welcome to this session. I'm Judy Colorado. I'm the Chief Nursing Officer and Vice President of Patient Care Services in one of the hospitals of RWJ Barnabas Health System, which is one of the largest, if not the largest health system in New Jersey. And so how did I witness grief for the past year? First, I would like to talk about my experience as a hospital leader. Oh my, for the past year, it has been tremendous, significantly.
Uh-oh, Judy, looks like we actually accidentally hit the mute button. There we go.
There you go. So
Thanks.
first and foremost, I would like to talk about my experience in the hospital setting. Our clinical team, the first part of the height of the pandemic, I would say that we have experienced death like we've never experienced before throughout our healthcare career. And truly, this plays a tremendous toll, significant toll on our clinicians, our nurses, our doctors, our therapists, and everyone that touched that patient. I remember really walking on the hallways and just providing support to our staff because they were really devastated with, at least throughout the 24 hours a day, day in and night in and day out, we have experienced these rapid calls of, resuscitation to patients that were inflicted with COVID. Now, secondly, although I have been spared from family and maybe specifically immediate family, even though they've contracted COVID, but have been spared to loss of life, it was very challenging. My family work in the healthcare field. My husband is a nurse, a dialysis nurse. My son is a clinical pharmacist at the trauma center, RWJ University Hospital in New Brunswick. And my daughter-in-law is also a nurse in one of the hospitals in New Jersey. And I remember when my daughter-in-law contracted COVID, my son called me and said, "Mommy, I have to prepare for the worst." And I would say that statement started, I felt that my son started to grieve and I started to sense grief because you don't know what's going to happen. And so we lost some type of control of what we've known for many years and how to manage patients. And I've seen that, overall in the clinical setting, as well as in our work and our experiences as we shared them at the dinner table. And last but not the least, as a healthcare leader, I have witnessed loss and grief from my nursing leaders that I work closely every day. I have a nurse leader who lost her mom. I have a nurse leader who lost a friend. I have a nurse leader who lost a brother. And so as I feel and sense their grief, it was very, very significant to me. So the question was, how do I now lead this group moving forward? So truly, Jesse and everybody, grief and loss for the past year has been significant that I've never experienced such in my whole life and entire career.
Thanks, Judy. Courtney, we've had a little bit of internet issues going on for Courtney, so I'm hoping she's still here, but I'll check in with you to see if you're able to jump in.
I think I'm here.
Awesome. Thanks, Courtney.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me, Jesse. So what has grief looked like over the past year? So before I get into that, I serve multiple roles. I serve the role of mom, I serve the role of social worker, therapist, daughter, and many others that need mentioning, but we don't have enough time for that. So we'll just stay with those few. So grief on a person, I want to start personally, and then I'll go into what it looked like work-wise. On a personal level, it looked like me trying to educate my 4-year-old in being a preschool teacher and the loss of the structure that came with him having school and his loss in structure of having friends to play with. He only had mommy to play with. And while that was fine for like the first 2 or 3 weeks, he got tired of it and so did I. It looked like not being able to connect and spend the time that I normally would, because we had a daily structured life. we were constantly on the move. We were constantly connecting with others, play dates, being able to go out and have fun. That was gone. And then we moved into just trying to find a structure and a routine that was nothing like the one that we had before. So there was loss of that, loss of structure, loss of routine, loss of ability to even buy toilet tissue. That was a thing over a year ago. So that was on a personal basis. But at work, I realized over this past year how much I missed just being in the building and took for granted what it meant to interact with my students. Naturally, I'm an introvert, but I realized that it kicks into gear more so when I am not with my kids after I have expelled all of the energy during the school day. So I was seeking ways to try and connect with others that didn't involve the screen. We had to adjust, and on a higher level, it meant supporting others through the loss that they were experiencing, family members dying, not being able to see family members that you typically would interact with on a regular basis, not being able to travel and move around as freely as you said. So in my work as a social worker, it meant trying to connect others with resources, focusing on self-care in a different way and how you can empower yourself to do things, to just cope on a daily basis. It meant being alone with your own thoughts and helping people navigate through that. There's so much more that I could say, but it just meant change. It meant change, and it meant viewing things much differently.
Thanks, Courtney. All right, Chuck, you can jump in here.
Unmute me. I think that if I could take us back a year, it's hard to believe. It's actually longer than that, because I think our last worship service was Good Friday, and we canceled Easter services. And Christians, after Easter is over, the priestly thing you do, which I always, of course, am the person who does it. You come into the worship service and you bring in the candle, which is the light of Christ and the light of hope. And we haven't brought that thing back in yet. We're going to start worship services, I think, June 20th. And I think it's going to probably be pretty emotional. And really, it's for us in some sense, Christians use the metaphor of death and resurrection, and we haven't had that resurrection hope before us in that length of time. It's been really challenging, and that uncertainty was very difficult in the beginning, particularly. So the very first thing we had to do was to try to do an emergency, keep people together in community, and we formed small groups and divided the congregation up kind of arbitrarily. And appointed leaders and got small groups to meet. And, I don't know that we could have really done anything like that short of having a pandemic. So it's interesting the way that these things, they were always theoretically doable, but no one ever found them necessary in the past. And after the pandemic came, it was an immediate, okay, we'll sign up for that, And so we started off in a new direction. I think the worst part about the year, I got actually a couple of points, and I'll come back to Judy in the end here. I think the worst part, though, is for people who had folks that died during the year, particularly people whose husband or spouse died last March or April, because they've really never done a funeral for them. We've had a few graveside services and stuff, but it was just with the immediate family. There was never the sense of support that you get from the wider community. And even though people reached out and cards were important, I am certain by talking to these widows and widowers that they felt this tremendous isolation this year that has made their grief much more problematic, like a wound that won't heal right. And yet at the same time, I have to say that there's a line from one of Joni Mitchell's songs, that the bed's too big and the frying pan's too wide. I think that was just kind of magnified, for everyone. And we're actually going to have a backlog of in-person funerals to honor people in the fall, beginning in the fall, because that was when people thought they could get their families together again. And those will be meaningful, but man, that didn't work. It's one thing you realize about community and being separated. You really have to be around people. I will say though, on that front, we had to change our worship service around completely too. We tried just filming what we do on Sunday. That's bad TV. So we completely ditched that, and we've invented kind of a new genre for worship, and people like that so much, and they tuned in, and it became kind of a big hit, that we were asked to do a couple of funerals using that format. And it was very interesting to see, because these are people that had moved from Summit years ago and now live, say, in New Mexico or Florida. And we were able to gather all of these people around the nation who probably wouldn't have been able to come to a funeral if we'd had it physically, but many of them wouldn't have been able to come without COVID. It's just and we were able to draw in a lot more folks. I think the thing that was interesting about it, one of them in particular that stuck with me, guy was a physicist at Bell Labs in his career life here, is also a fantastic musician. And because of the pieces that we were able to put together with these virtual choirs, we were able to have his kids, then his cousins and his extended family play some of his music. And even though they were not in the same room in many cases, the pieces just came off and they were really meaningful. It was very moving to see all these people paying that kind of tribute together. And I think the thing about that, after I watched it, because we were in real trepidation about whether it would work or not, or whether it would be sentimental and cheesy, but it wasn't. It actually hit the right note. And the thing that struck me is that the family, I'm willing to predict, a year from now, we'll be watching that together in some sort of form, because it's a great thing. I remember when I was first studying about grief, I came across a quote that a woman was saying that eventually you get to a point with grief that becomes like a precious item that you have, and you can put it in a box on your dresser. And maybe once or twice a year, you can open that box and take it out and see it again. And then you can put it back. And that's the beautiful thing about getting through grief, is that comes this point when you can take it out and put it back without it becoming an overwhelming thing. And I thought, these memorials that we do on video like that, at least pieces of them have that potential to become a kind of keepsake that you'll use in the future. And we never had done anything like that in the past, and probably wouldn't have thought about it, and certainly wouldn't have thought about using it in that way. But having done it, I imagine this is maybe something that we'll be able to kind of keep around. The final thing, though, that I wanted to share, and then I'll open this to go back, is to follow up on what Judy was saying. In addition to just serving my local church, I'm also on the board this year for Overlook Hospital, our local hospital in the area. In April and May of last year, we came exceedingly close to having more people sick than we had ventilators for. And this creates what is called moral hazard. And the trauma around this is far more significant than I think most of us were aware. I fortunately spent this year reading Bessel van der Kolk's book on The Body Keeps Score. He teaches on trauma at Harvard Medical School, and he's done a lot of the research on healing Vietnam vets, and then he applied that to sexual abuse cases and a lot of different forms of trauma that people have survived, and he's developed what works and doesn't work. And I don't think that the rest of our country fully realizes how much stress we put upon our medical workers as we went through this. I had 2 board meetings in April and May, where we had our ICU people that came in. These are tough guys for the most part. I mean, they see a lot of death, but as Judy was pointing out, this is a death at an unprecedented rate. And also the way that it was handled, because we couldn't have the families offloading it, so the staff had to absorb and physically bring phones so that they could talk to their relatives as they were in the process of dying. So they ended up not wanting to be chaplains, but they had to be chaplains as they were going through this. And when you have people that feel like they cannot do their job, they are traumatized, even though they've done the best they could and they've done a great job but they are traumatized through this. And I had these ICU doctors that were sharing, and then they'd stop and weep because what they'd been through had taken them right up to their limit of what they could tolerate. And you saw down in Houston, Texas, we also came very close there to having, and you're watching it right now in India, where it is literally happening, that they cannot care for everybody. And the aftershock on that, first of all, the morals of that are dramatic. And you can't do this to people. And we can't do this to staff in the future. And I think all of us at the hospital came away from this experience, just thank God we dodged a bullet, because if we'd had to choose, it turns out we had this list of criteria. What are we going to do if we get into a situation where we don't have enough ventilators? How are we going to decide who gets a ventilator and who doesn't? We had this great set of criteria. Then we went out to beta test it, and it found out no one could do it. Small problem. And that nobody can actually pick who gets in the lifeboat and who doesn't get in the lifeboat. You can have the best criteria you want, but no one wants to be in that position because they don't feel qualified. And that was a huge thing. And I hope going forward, we actually, as a society, begin to deal with this more fully, because we really need to. I'm going to leave it there. I could say other things, but.
Thank you. So one thing that I'm kind of picking up in terms of a theme from all of your responses so far is this idea of kind of the personal and the professional, this intersection, and how this last year has really been a stress test for our systems, for our healthcare, for our workplaces, for us as leaders. So I'm wondering, and we had shared a little outline for some questions, but I'm asking a question that's a little bit off of script here. This idea of leadership through a time like this, like what lessons are you taking away with you on how to keep people grounded, how to keep yourself grounded? I think we all have seen, and there's been a lot of turnover, both in healthcare, but also in schools and in many other places where people have just been taxed and pushed, I think, way beyond their limit. So how are you thinking as a leader about helping people to stay grounded in the wake of a year like this one? What lessons can we take away going forward?
So I'm going to start by answering that question. So I'm going to start from a personal level. And I think one of the biggest challenges as a leader at the height of the pandemic or during pandemic, and even now that we are recalibrating, is how to stay grounded as a leader, right? First of all, I want to acknowledge that I too experience grief at a different level. It was just tremendously, in all the different levels of you've mentioned earlier, Jesse, emotional, physical, intellectual, spiritual. I had that toll on me. However, I have to stand firm, and I have to tell myself, how do now I lead my team moving forward and in the midst of these challenges. So one of the things that I would like to share is that I have to deal with my grief in a personal way, and found refuge to the ones that I've really practiced previously in dealing with stress and dealing with crisis, dealing with personal problems, if you will. I have a very strong spiritual background, and I have found solace in reading Psalms and reading my journals, even from previous years, and how I've journaled how I, as a leader, have grown and tapped the leader within me. And then resorted to a lot of self reflection and self care as much as I could. Also tap on my support system. The second piece is I said I got to use this to really build something for my team and develop something for my team. So based from our system, we have, the system has developed this Connect Together platform where we have different menus of different resources available for employees. And that's when I came to know Good Grief. I reached out to Joe Primo, who's the CEO of Good Grief. And I said, Joe, we have to do something. And it was very organic. Joe engaged me into this conversation of what are you experiencing? How are you as a leader at this point? How is your grief level? And attack me on that personal way. And I was able to share everything to him. And then we developed together 3 webinars for my nursing leaders. And it was just a very, I would say, important. It was helpful to me, very therapeutic to me. So we had those 3 webinars in different time frames. When we were ending the first surge was the first webinar. And then when we were entering into the second surge, and as we were winding down. So I would say, as a leader, you have to acknowledge that you too is experiencing grief. As a leader, you too is vulnerable. As a leader, you lost control. And in acknowledging that, you are aware of those emotions, of those spiritual reflective moments, and use those to develop something that will help you as well as help your team. And I think that what we've done was a way to have my team express their grief. It was very honest and raw. And I was just in the background. Joe facilitated the process. And I was jotting down as a leader what I was listening, what I was hearing, and use those now to recalibrate moving forward, to do a different plan, to forge a way forward, to forge a pathway for resilience as individual leaders and as teams, and to forge a pathway to lead at such a time as this in different ways, like we have not been doing before. So it created a lot of innovation and energy and that synergy with Good Grief, I would say. And it's not because we're having this Good Grief webinar, but I just want to say that thank you, because it helped me as a leader at such a time as this. And wow, I said, acknowledgement, and sometimes as leader, when you are saying to yourself, there's denial at some point. I should be able to do this. I should be able to step in and refocus and to be able to say that, I got this. Well, let me tell you, the past year, the unprecedented nature of this challenge was really something that we have never prepared in our careers, in our experience, in our expertise, in the things that I've learned in leadership and all that. It is only when you acknowledge that you too is experiencing the same thing as your patients, as their family members, as your staff, and one of the things is that just actively listening. And 3 things: to be there as an authentic presence in the midst of crisis, assuring, supportive, hands-on, and servant leadership, and calm and compose as much as you could. And I come back to my office. My day started early at like 5 a.m. as we go through briefings, and there's no end. at night, 11:30, 12 a.m., we were still on the phone trying to figure out what could be our clinical protocol for this. And of those, you have to be able to step back a little and take a breather. It was difficult. But only when you acknowledge as a leader you need that, then you can lead.
Thanks, Judy.
I guess I'll go next. I really love what Judy just shared, actually, because as I was writing notes to myself on, what did it mean? It helped me to reflect a little bit further. I've always been, and I wish you all could see my face, but I've always been an advocate for self-care, a proponent of mental health, and like educating people on those things. That is part of my role as lead social worker in my school. I'm educating the educators on maintaining their mental health and making it optimal and focusing on self-care and how are you taking care of you so you can show up and do the job that you need to do. It shifted a little bit during the pandemic because number one, isolation, but also how are you showing up for you? It was less of how are you showing up so you can show up for others? How are you showing up for you? In that piece that Judy said about what I took away, being transparent in how you're feeling, was what I was pushing for my team, my social work team that consisted of 5 + 2 interns, and then also for even the school leadership team. Like, it's okay that you're not doing okay, and we have to say that. So if you're not saying it, then you're ignoring it and you're staying in the denial of it all. And are you really doing well if you're not acknowledging how you're feeling? Or are you continuing to just try and push through, go through the motions, become a robot in whatever it is that you're doing? And at this point, like a robot on Zoom, and not really allowing yourself to feel, which was important, especially in the beginning. We are all grieving and we're trying to keep normal as whatever normal was and what it won't be again. And even what I'm thinking about now is, even with people taking their masks off, now to me, that's not normal. Keep your mask on. What are you doing? So there's going to be another wave of grief or loss or change as we continue to adjust. But just recognizing how you're feeling and focusing on that mental health bit and saying to yourself, mood meter was my favorite tool to use over this past year, because we were finding words that we didn't even know existed for how we were feeling. And it's like, ooh, that's the one. In leading a meeting or canceling a meeting and saying, hey, I just want to check in and see how you feel, and then you can go on and do whatever it is that you need to do in this space and time, helped to get to where we needed to be, which was just connecting on the basic human level. How are you doing? How are you doing? It's not always about the work. And I think that that was what one of my key takeaways was, and key messages that I would share is, it's not only about the work. You matter, how you feel matters. And guess what? If you need to take a rest, then you need to take a rest and close the laptop. That's it. So mental health first.
Thanks, Courtney.
I pick up on that thing. I think it came back to me when I was 23 years old, and I just had gone into divinity school, graduated from college, and I was a young father and just got married. And my first job was an ER chaplain in a major urban hospital. And about week 5 or 6, something like that, there was like 9 deaths in 1 week. And there were a lot of them were very tragic. Brother shooting brother, 2 children dying in a car accident. These terrible things that happen that were, they all come to the emergency room and they fall in your lap and you have to deal with them. I was just a kid at the time. And I had a meeting with what my director at the end of the week, or our regularly scheduled meeting, and he looked at me and listened to all that had been going on. And he was like, I want you to take the week off next week and go do something else. And he had me come up with a list of a couple books that I would like to read that aren't academic books, but were like things just to change the channel. And I remembered that this year for the first time. Many years later, he was really wise. You get to a point where if you watch too much death, or if you're around it too much, you have to start shutting down to, and when you shut down, you can't help other people move through it. And so he saw me shutting down, and probably way more than, of course, I would have realized. I was young and naive and thought I could handle everything, and this is all past, but it is more profound than that. Now that I'm older, I realize that how true that is. I think as a leader too, one of the things that I was quick to give up, and it was easy because I've been in this mindset already for a while. I'm not the expert with all the answers, and we have been going through some difficult situations because there's so much change happening in the church in general, and with religion in our society in general. I go to these seminars all the time, and we hear these supposed experts, but they don't know any more than I do. They just know that this change is really profound, and that what used to happen in the past is not going to happen in the future. And I am also really fortunate where I am in the church that I lead. I have a lot of people who are Wall Street people, or managers, or McKinsey consultant type people. And when I said, I don't have the answer to what's going on here, but the answer, the experts are actually gathered right here. And why don't we figure it out ourselves? And one of my lawyers, who is an entrepreneur, said, this is a good year to do visioning. So that's what we did for the year, and switched gears in the midst of that much chaos, not knowing what's going to come out on the other side. We chose to use the year, and it did bring the congregation together, because as it turns out, via Zoom, you can still have fairly meaningful sessions where you're asking questions about what is it that we do well, and I try to identify how we can multiply and grow those things. And it ended up being a very productive year, largely because I didn't feel like I needed to take control of the whole situation, but rather to let the laity actually step up and lead, which they did. It was beautiful.
I love this. I'm just jotting down a few of the kind of things I'm taking away from that. And thank you to all three of you. So this idea, Judy, of being attentive to yourself, being authentic with your team when you are struggling, that we also grieve and struggle through these experiences. Really important. And Courtney, just taking away from you, this idea of kind of focusing on your mental health and well-being, being flexible and open to, like, we just have to take time when we need to take time, is incredibly important. Chuck, I love this idea of being open to change, and that sometimes this change can happen in these moments. It can be a real catalyst for change that's not always even driven by us as leaders. Sometimes about us getting out of the way and allowing other people to give voice to shaping what is going to happen in the future. I love that. Thank you. So another question I had, this I think related to this, and it goes back to this idea that I mentioned previously, that grief is a really non-linear process. And there's many people that still assume that, in 6 or 12 months, people should be getting back to normal again. And in Good Grief, we've been talking about this idea of people potentially feeling left behind when the world is ready to rush forward and get back to normal, whatever normal looks like. And this is a really common conversation in our world of bereavement as well. Grieving people know that there is no going back to normal as it was before, but only a possibility of creating a new normal that integrates this experience of loss into our lives. So with that in mind, I'm wondering, who do you fear in your respective worlds about being left behind as the world rushes back to get back to normal again? And then what do you hope to do to ensure that those people aren't left behind in the midst of this kind of sea change that we're about to go through and return to normalcy? I hope that question was clear.
Yeah, I'm going to respond from my heart as a mother. And I know I appreciate Courtney's introduction that, we're also mothers, right? Wife, friend, daughter, leader. So, as a mother, I have a 34-year-old daughter who has special needs. And when the pandemic hit, she wasn't able to go to the day center that she was going into for socialization and a lot of activities. And also, church was a big part of her socialization and a safe sanctuary for her. So we were, and not just for her, but the school, our children that were also having this hybrid, or at some point they were fully virtual, is that to adapt to technology. And she adapted to that very slowly. And as the demand of the use of technology in all virtual sessions that she's now attending, I really fear for her to really cope with that and move forward and be able to, maximize technology within her capacities and abilities to navigate through. So what we have been doing is that my husband and I, we have been really working with the different people that she works with every day, the artists, the musicians and all that, to really tailor a program that's really individualized for her, so that we can continue to provide that support. And I think not just in her experience, but also in our experience as healthcare leaders with experience, like how many percent increase of Zooming, go to meetings. But the blessing of that is really not, is more productive, I believe, for us, because we now are able to do this in our comfort, in the comfort of our offices, and prevent again, that travel time that we usually spend an hour to go to a meeting area or location. But I too have made it a commitment to really learn more about the features of different technologies that we can use this time. So I've ramped up my education. So that's what I've been doing as well. And so this is, I think, as we lead to a new normal, the use of technology is going to be really very important. As a nurse leader, I fear, I've observed that some of my nurses who have experienced COVID themselves and had COVID, there are really at least one, two, or three of them that really have not come back to the bedside. They really need more time for rehab. So we created a program, at least in our hospital, led by our director of our rehab services, COVID rehabilitation program. And, that came about because we've observed that a number of our staff who experienced or had COVID themselves really have not fully returned to their usual routine and in normal work. So I have a little bit of I feel for them, and I touch base with them often, and just asking them how they're doing. So again, and I've seen also a number of nurses who were not thinking of retiring, are retiring early and or even leaving the profession.
Yeah.
And so one of the challenges of this is that we know that in the next years, we're going to onboard newer nurses that just came off from school. And so again, I think those individuals that truly are still recovering and going through grief, if you will, and also going through rehabilitation, I fear for them. And I think what we've done, creating a rehab program and also touching base with them, showing you care, and even if they have gone through, let's say, a longer term disability, but we connect with them still so that we can support them. And we can continue to learn as well about the things we need to do as a healthcare system, as a healthcare organization, to provide services that truly are very important for their recovery.
Thanks, Judy.
I was just going to add something that's a little different than exactly the question you asked, Jesse, but it's very related. Beginning last summer, something like 700,000 people moved from Manhattan out to the suburbs, or they left New York and moved to other parts of the country altogether. That'll push the prices up. So an unprecedented number of my neighbors moved, and I think what was going on, I haven't had a chance to contact each and every one of them, because a lot of them left without really exactly saying goodbye. They had some perfunctory goodbye on social media, but I certainly didn't get a chance to hug their neck and say a prayer for them as they go or anything like that. And, I think a lot of people in the middle of the year just started adding up their life. This became one of those moments in time collectively where all of us go through these moments in our lives. This is just, the only thing that's different is we all went through this one together, where we were saying, just like Judy's saying, do I really need to be practicing medicine? I love being a nurse, but at the same time, this is a very stressful job. My life is short. I've done this, but I think I'm going to do something else, and I'm going to live a more balanced life. What I hear a lot from my younger people right now is they're worried about going back because their spouses were able to be home so that their marriages had more balance with doing domestic duties this year. And now going back, that's going to go, if we go back to normal with the long commute. And I have to say, that's another thing. I have been in New York many times in the past few months. And somehow it's more painful now when you miss that train coming back to New Jersey and you have to wait 45 minutes for the next one. It's like, I just don't have the patience for that. And you multiply that by tens of thousands of people. I don't know that they're going to go back and that they want to go back to what was before. It's actually, the new normal is going to have a lot of new to it. And to me, it remains to be seen whether we even fill up all those office buildings downtown in the future, because, it was already that way, that Friday was not the commute. I would drive to New York as often as take the train because there's not that much traffic. And during this year, the traffic really went down. And for the first time, Manhattan was somewhat manageable. And I don't know. I think that is just a symbol for other parts of our life that have become more manageable, that we're going to be really reluctant to give up, because I think more of us have realized we need a sense of balance in our lives. And when we were younger or in the old system, we never questioned the fact that we were going at this high rate of intensity with these long hours, and because that's just what you did. But I wonder if that's going to be adequate going forward. I'm sure it's not. Yeah.
Thanks, Chuck. Courtney, are you still there?
I'm still here.
Okay.
I don't really have anything to add to this question specifically, though.
That's fine. That's fine. All right. Well, we have a few more minutes before I want to open it up for Q&A. And the last question I want to ask, and just ask us to be mindful of our responses so we leave plenty of time for the group to ask some questions. This one's kind of more future oriented. So we are called Good Grief for a reason, not because of Charlie Brown, but it's because we believe that grief can be a good, healthy process when those who are grieving find themselves in a supportive and caring community. So we believe that through grief, we can even experience growth and positive change in our lives. So I want to ask each of you, what are you hopeful for on the other side of this? How do you see the potential for positive growth and change in your own lives, workplaces, communities?
I'll go first on this one, actually. I am hopeful for the growth that everyone has experienced, but also what at least the past year has shown us, past year and change now has shown us, that there is no ceiling, and there's really no limits onto what you can do. What I really, though I at one point despised Zoom, it allowed us to be in rooms that we would have never been in. It allowed us to see things. It's allowing us to have someone here from Turkey to participate. It has really expanded our reach in general, and I'm hopeful that people will see that as an opportunity to access more people, to learn new things, to do new things, and recognize that it's limitless, both personally and professionally. You have, or we have seen just a level of connectivity that was not visible before. One that has sprouted different, I would be remiss if I didn't mention like all of the violence that has taken place and has been televised, and how that has brought about change that's been necessary. It's been a lived experience, but over this past year, the grief was shared across the world. Sorry for the noise in the background. But yeah, I am hopeful that this has opened everyone's eyes to the access that we have.
Thanks, Courtney.
Yeah, I agree with Courtney. I think limitless, and I see myself, my life, I will live it to the fullest of my potential. I think that's what I see on the other side. It's limitless. It's really provided us a way to either step back and look forward. And I see myself as really, again, living to my full potential as a mother, as a wife, as a daughter, as a leader, and as a member of my community. And from and I want to share this because I've done a lot of reflections, and I think that I want to extend more of my humanity, to expand my capacity to love, to offer kindness, to do goodness, to do just and mercy work. And with all the things that we are experiencing, even on top of the pandemic, is this pandemic of racism, these issues surrounding that, and all of the things, our collective experiences really challenge me to really expand also my capacity to do justice work, to do mercy work, and to be more kind. And as a nurse leader and as an executive in the healthcare industry, I see potential. On the other side, we've experienced here innovation and just expanding that to redesign our healthcare processes, our models of care, the way we manage and the way we lead. I see potential for innovation in terms of managing our resources, and also human resources as well as different levels of resources. I've experienced doing staffing in a hospital differently during the pandemic. And the question now in our leadership team, in our chief nursing officer executive team in the system, is that why is it that we should be continuing the innovation, the way we have experienced and how we've managed. And so there's a lot of room in terms of redesign of processes. So I'm just so excited, I think, and it's limitless. Courtney, I agree with you. It is limitless, and I want to tap to that. I have so much thoughts and creative thoughts and energy to step into the new normal. It's scary, but I am confident that as collectively, as a community, as a healthcare system, as a community, in my perspective, and us individuals and groups and teams and leveraging partnership in the community as well to all different stakeholders, I just see possibilities. So I'm very excited, but at the same time, of course, trying to sense that we are able to step into the new normal and be able to lead our team in ways that we haven't really imagined before.
A year ago, I realized Christianity is a very germy religion. We share one loaf, one cup. We exchange the peace every week and shake hands. And I remember having, we hug one another when we're sad. You know, I could go on and on. There's a lot of this. We do a lot of blessing. All babies, I not only bless them, I usually kiss them, and then I carry them so that everybody else in the congregation can touch them as well. We're a very touchy-feely, religion. And I really like that. It was such a disappointing thing to see that headline a year and a half ago that the two most dangerous things you could do were go to a bar or sing in church. I like my two favorite pastimes are out the window for a while. And I'm looking forward to getting back to this germy faith again because it's embedded. I noticed during the course of the year that when we pulled images from the church in the past and put them into our worship services, the image that was the most popular was a kind of a tradition that I developed and started. I used to lay hands on our confirmation class, and from there we expanded it to, if you're leaving or moving, we'll come lay hands on you. And the way that we would do it, I would lay hands on them, other associate pastors would, and then maybe their mentor and their family would lay hands on them. And then we'd have the rest of the congregation lay hands on the family so that the whole church looked like one rugby scrum, And that image of us all blessing one another and standing one another up and supporting one another became so popular because that's really, I think, what spirituality in its authentic moment is really all about. And I think that as we go back, I'm going to lay intentionality about that and make sure we're doing it more often and just channeling positive blessing towards other people. And, I've realized kind of the power of ritual. Only by ritual, when you say that in religion, because most of us come from traditions where we do the same damn thing over and over and over and over, it doesn't sound very exciting. I think this is really a time to rewrite our liturgies in light of what we now know. And when I say ritual, I mean doing things that make more humane sense around everything we do in life, but certainly around what we do with death, because we don't have the same view about death that we did 500 years ago. And we've learned new things and we need to roll all that in. And actually, I think we're better poets today than they were in the past. And so those type of things going forward, I suspect are going to be profound, important, and permanent changes.
Excellent. Thank you. I think if I had to summarize that, I am just personally feeling like a lot of optimism from the three of you, and connects back to this idea that grief, loss can be a real, again, catalyst for change. And if we're grounded in the right values and sense of shared purpose and living our life to the fullest and making sure that we are grounded in our shared humanity and love and goodness and justice and being fully embodied, and new appreciation for that, and reimagining our rituals, that we could, go forward into a really wonderful new kind of chapter in our shared lives together, reclaiming the things that are most important in our lives. So thank you to the three of you. I want to open it up for questions now for folks that are in the session here. Go ahead and use the Q&A box if you'd be willing to. It's the easiest way for me to keep track of the questions. So you should be able to find that at the bottom bar there on the little Zoom feature. It says Q&A. You can click on that and ask any questions that you might have for the group here in the time that we have left. So just give us a moment or two to put those questions in. If there are any, no questions coming in so far. Okay, we've got a couple coming in here. Here's one. What books or articles would you recommend that has helped you learn about grief, self-awareness, self-care? This could be ones that you've read or you've shared with people that you work with. Any recommendations that the three of you would suggest?
Oh, man, that is so. This is hard for me to answer because I have a whole shelf of books that I keep buying new things all of the time. I would just generally say, answer to that question. You know, when I was in divinity school, we had very, very few resources on grief that had been developed. I mean, and so we were kind of with Kubler-Ross, and that was it. They kind of handed you that whatever that little thing, and then you sent you on your way. Today, the dynamics around recovery from trauma and grief are so much more pronounced, and there's just too many of them to mention. If I could get up and go grab all the books off my shelf, I would be able to answer that for you, because there's several out there that are very good. But as I said before, Bessel van der Kolk's book is actually, or his work in general, is a good place to start. And he's got a lot of just follow the footnotes in his work. That's pretty safe.
I just typed that book into the chat for everybody. Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score. Really great book.
Definitely a great one, and one of many on my shelf. What Happened to You is also a really good book.
Yeah.
Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing. I actually had to open my Amazon cart for that one. There's one more that I
Courtney,
just
that's
have.
Oprah, and someone else wrote that with Oprah,
Yes.
correct?
Yes, correct. That is Oprah, and I will. If you put it in Amazon, it'll come up. Bruce Perry.
Bruce Perry. Yep.
Yeah, he's a doctor. And then there was another one that I absolutely just passed. Set Boundaries, Find Peace. That's by Nedra Tawwab. That's Tawwab, I believe, or it might be double A. And then there's the Racial Healing Handbook. That's another one. Depending on where you are in your grieving process and what you're grieving about, I think that's a good span.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just gonna add, It's Okay That You're Not Okay. That's also good, by Megan Devine. And I read a lot of C. Lewis books, and it's really a grief observed. So those are the two things.
Great. And then another question that was kind of related to that one, and this one might be the last question that we have time for, is how would the three of you recommend maybe starting conversations about grief and grief in the workplace? If those conversations maybe, I'm assuming they're maybe not happening yet, like how would you bridge that gap and start that dialogue, and especially thinking about creating a sense of safety and all of that in the midst of it?
And
Go ahead.
yeah, Judy, you probably have more to say about this than I do directly, but and overlook what we did. First of all, is the top management in the hospital realized pretty early that we needed to have support groups that didn't exist previously, because there weren't need for them. So we formed them, and they're with a code of ethics around how we structured those. And these are widely available, but basically you have to agree that the people, whatever's said in the room stays in the room. This is kind of the fundamental point around it. But to allow those to develop and to start meeting on a regular basis, and surprisingly, they carried on throughout the entire year. And now we've started to kind of build them into our job description, so that there's a place for that, because there wasn't a place for that previously.
Mm.
And I think that's really the key, having conversations. I think that one thing that's interesting about the moment is that top management is getting it in a way that they probably wouldn't have like 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
This would have been considered to be too time consuming and too therefore costly.
Yeah.
But now people are willing to recognize that this is actually going to save us money, and certainly save us people from walking out the door who are really talented that we want to keep.
Yeah. Great.
Now, in my context, I would say this, that it's very important, at least for me as a leader, to have established those initial conversations, because I do one-to-ones with my leaders, and overall, in that part of that is personal connection. And in that personal connection moment, they're able to share with you things that they're experiencing, whether it be grief or anything, family connections or anything. So providing a space for that and listening. And, I've used those when we were experiencing this magnitude of this past year, that I was able to just say, why don't we come together and let's just, start sharing our experiences in different areas. How are your staff in that area? And to your point, Chuck, it's really very important to assure that this is a safe space. And I think sharing my story first empowered my team to share their own. Being vulnerable in front of them was powerful, a powerful motivation to say that, yes, your leader is also experiencing the same thing.
Yeah.
And so this is a safe space. So that's the second point. The third is really getting facilitators that truly are also able to navigate and facilitate, and just be an observer and not facilitating as a leader. So allowing that process to really just go through the natural progression of that. And it turned out to be, and again, I'm saying the good grief facilitation was very important experience in my observation, because they were very transparent. And so I think beginning again to your connection to your people, and then saying that I too experienced the same, and I too I've cried in front of them. I've pause and be silent in front of them.
Yeah.
And that allowed that authentic moment to really be, yeah, we're all in this together. And what came out of that, we were able to come together in the middle of this experience, and almost saying that we are more empowered together in our grief together, in our leading together, and in our journey together in this experience.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks.
And just to add to that, just checking in, starting with simply asking, how are you doing today? How are you showing up today?
Mm-hmm.
And then following that up with a why. If you're comfortable sharing why, let us know. We'll open the door to so many conversations.
Yeah.
Creating that trust and creating the being transparent. And most times, I think the best way, and Judy spoke to this, was allowing them to see how I was actually feeling, and them knowing that, no, this is not a facade. Like, I am struggling. I'm in the blue today, and I don't want to be here right now in this space. I want to sleep. Those conversations really made the team feel comfortable. And I'm not talking about in this moment, but those conversations really made the team feel comfortable to know that I can actually share this with you all. And today is really hard, and I don't know how I'm going to get through it, but I'm going to do my best. Just creating the space with authenticity and acknowledging and honoring how you're showing up will allow for the conversations to flow.
Great. Thank you. Well, once again, thank you to the three of you for joining us. We are right at time here, so I'm going to go ahead and move to closing out our session. But just have a lot of gratitude for each of you, for Judy and Courtney and Chuck, for you sharing your experiences and your stories with us. I myself am taking away a lot from our time together and some renewed optimism. And I'm hoping that everybody in the session is feeling that as well, that we have a real opportunity in front of us as leaders and as individuals and families and communities to create good, lasting change out of what has been a really horrific experience for everyone. So thank you once again to the three of you. As we close out the session, I just want to remind everybody who's here today that you can find all kinds of resources beyond this discussion related to grief and loss, books, articles, tip sheets, all kinds of stuff on our webpage. I'll put that into the chat. Also, if you or someone you know could benefit from our programs or support services, you can also find that on the resources page as well. You can even, if you're not in our area, search for support within your local community on our website too, by just typing in your zip code or address. We are going to be taking a break from our webinars over the next couple of months here for the summer, but we will be resuming these next fall. So the next one you will see from us is in September. So keep your eyes and ears out for that. And again, thank you everybody so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. And I hope everyone has a wonderful summer, and we'll see you again soon. All right. Thanks, everyone.
See you, Jesse.
Bye.
Be good, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.